Here we are at episode 13 of After School with Mr. Van Huss. This is going to be the last episode before a little bit of a holiday break, and I'm about halfway through this little project that I've been working on this year. So far, everybody that has taken the time to speak with me has been amazing, and they've all had such great advice that I hope everybody's listening to. We're going to end with a very special one here today. You see, a few years ago, I read this book, March. I went on to read book 2 of March, went on to read book 3 of March, and went on to read its sequel, Run. Now, if you've never read March and you don't know what it is, this is the story of the civil rights movement, told through the eyes of Congressman John Lewis, who was very instrumental in a lot of these events happening. And a few years ago, John Lewis worked with Andrew Aydin and Nate Powell to create this series of books. And it went on to win the National Book Award, being, I believe, the first comic book to win the National Book Award. Many Eisners, many other awards and recognitions along the way. This is a life-changing story. It was life-changing for the people that lived it. I think reading it now, it can be a life-changing story because it is incredibly impactful. I've always loved teaching about the civil rights movement. It's something I've always been interested in learning about. I knew about it, I taught it, but I didn't know about a lot of the things in the story. And this gave me such a deeper understanding and a deeper meaning. This whole series of books is part of a graphic novel library that I have here in my classroom. And I've seen numerous students over the years check these out and read them and just gain a greater appreciation for what happened during that period in our country's history. So today, Andrew Aydin, the author of these books, was nice enough to sit down and just tell me his story. He worked alongside John Lewis for quite a few years and knew him very, very well. And I can only imagine how cool and inspirational it would be to work alongside a national hero like that. So Andrew took time to tell me his story, and I hope you guys enjoyed it as much as I did. Here he is. Welcome to After School with Mr. Van Huss. Andrew, so happy to have you here today. I appreciate you taking the time out of your busy schedule.
No, it's good to be with you, sir. How you doing?
I'm doing excellent. So I have a graphic novel library here in my classroom because comics have always been a huge part of my life, and I grew up on DC and Marvel and all that stuff. And a couple of years ago, I added this set to my graphic novel library along with this one here in my classroom. And these books have been checked out by my students a number of times, and they love it. And I really wanted to talk to you today to get some of the story behind that and just hear a little bit about you. So for anybody watching that isn't familiar with you, I'm going to let you just kind of introduce yourself and tell us what it is that you do.
Sure. Kind of a crazy story when you really look back on it. I was raised by a single mother. My father was a Turkish immigrant who left when I was very young, and I started reading comics because my mother was a reader. But for me, I spent this one summer at my grandmother's house, and my mom would send me up there when she needed a little bit of a break. And I love my grandmother, and she don't tell the rest of the family, but she would always say I was her favorite. And so, but I was always an indoor kid, right? And grandmama lived up in the mountains near Asheville. And sometimes everybody else would want to go out hiking or whatnot, and they would try and figure out something for me to do particularly when I was young. And my grandmother brought out one day my uncle's old comic books that he'd left behind at her house. And I was captivated. I mean, like, they were just, these amazing stories of people trying to do the right thing because it was the right thing to do. And so finally we went to a Piggly Wiggly over off of Hendersonville Highway. And they had this big rack of Spinner comics. And I asked my grandmother if I could have one, and she said yes. And I picked out, it was Uncanny X-Men 317, which was the Phalanx Covenant
Mm.
storyline, and it had that lenticular cover, you know,
Yep.
and that was where it started. And so when we would go to grocery stores or when we would go to places that had the spinner rack, I would always pick up either the X-Men, or I really got into Green Lantern and the Flash. That was back when Ron Mars and Daryl Banks were doing Green Lantern, and Mike Wieringo and Mark Waid were doing the Flash, and that was sort of my entry point into it. And at the same time, um, being raised by a single mother, particularly back then, the 80s and 90s, uh, it was not easy for her at all. And so many of the challenges that she faced were things that I couldn't avoid noticing. I mean, they were just part of our life. So much so that it developed in me a real sense of both right and wrong, but also just an awareness of the systemic inequalities in our society and the way in which we treat women, particularly single mothers, uh, especially back then. I mean, it was just a few years, maybe a decade since women had been allowed to have bank accounts without their husband's co-signature, right?
Mhm.
I mean, this was a different time, but also in many ways, I think it set up for my sensitivities to how we treat people.
Mm.
And so as I got older, I kept reading comics. My mother was just glad I was reading. My mother was the kind of person who uh, had a library card for me, had a library card for herself. She would have had a library card for the dog if she could have, because that would mean she could reserve more books. And so there's always books around the house. There's time in our schedule built around for us to read because Mama was reading, and then so I was supposed to read. And sometimes I'd read books, and sometimes I'd read comics. And as I got older, I started going to comic conventions. I would go to Dragon Con in Atlanta, and I remember seeing these creators making a living from the power of their ideas, which was profound to me that you could do that you could dream something up in your head, write it down on a piece of paper, and somehow that would help you and allow you to earn a living. Because we were poor, right? So the idea of earning a living was always on our mind, always on my mind. Mama was a she was such a good gardener that she would take cuttings of plants and then root them and then propagate them and then sell them at the curb market for extra money, right? It was always a hustle. It was always, how do we make that little bit extra? And so that was very much on my mind all the time. And when I saw them selling their art or their comics over the table, I was very conscious of the fact that they were earning a living this way. And it seemed so free to me, right? Like your value and worth wasn't determined by some arbitrary measure. It was determined by, or at least the value and worth of your ideas. It was determined by how people reacted to it. Because I think that was something else I was very conscious of and very much rebelled against as a child, which is the idea of this someone else deciding unilaterally about whether or not your ideas were good. Because I oftentimes felt that the people who had the power to decide that unilaterally were undeserving and had never faced challenges in their life. I didn't have a word for it at the time, but they were privileged, right? They'd grown up, they were spoiled. A lot of them were, call them Nepo babies these days, right? And I hated that. I mean, it really irked me. It was something that my whole life, I didn't want those kind of people to have power over me, because I'd seen how they had power over my mother and other people in my life. And at the same time, I was very much beholden to that system. So as I approached college, there was no money for me to go to college. It was either I pay for it myself or I get a scholarship. And I worked very hard to get AP scores and high SAT scores and all those things that allowed me to then get a scholarship to go to college. And I ended up getting a scholarship to go to a small liberal arts school in Hartford, Connecticut called Trinity College. And I'd never been out of the South quite like that. We've been on trips before, but I'd never spent a winter in New England, I'll tell you that. And I remember showing up to college totally unprepared. And it was really one of the times in which I realized most fully how poor we were, because I showed up with what I thought was a coat, and these New Englanders informed me that was called a jacket. And I did not have boots. I did not have any of the things that you're just supposed to have to get by. And I remember one of my friends actually bought me a winter coat, and gave it to me because I was just so unprepared. And in college, I became a little bit of a rabble rouser. I led sit-ins. I was on student government. In fact, the first sit-in I led, this is someone told me this whole story. I didn't understand all of it until later. But at one point, the school had decided for budget cuts that they were going to close down the library early, so that they could save some money. But for us kids who were on scholarship, they put us in dorms that were about the size of a closet, and they were loud, and people were having a little bit too much of a good time, and it wasn't really a place where we could work. And so to me, the library was where I could go. I could use the printer, I could use the computers, I could use all that space. And so myself and some of my colleagues in student government, we were very upset by this. So we decided to organize a sit-in. And this was my senior year that we really led the sit-in, and ended up forcing the administration to reverse course and keep the library open, and actually got them to make the library be open 24 hours a day. And I found out when I went back to Hartford to dedicate a mural that myself and my team had designed, that was installed at the school across the street. I went back for the dedication, and the governor's former chief of staff came in and told that story. And because he and I had been students together, and he told me a part that I didn't know, which was that they never changed it back. So for the last near 20 years, that library has been 24 hours, had been open for 24 hours a day because of that sit-in. And he was teasing me because he felt like it was appropriate that if I was going to do something, it would be nonviolent, organized, and keep the library open. so, so I had a good laugh about that. But when I went to college, I knew I needed a job, right? I was not one of those people who could find themselves after college. And so I did a lot of internships, and I didn't feel like I could afford to pursue a creative career. I did my major in political science, and my minor was in film studies, right? I was constantly juggling these two parts of my soul in some ways, this desire to help, but realizing that I needed a regular paycheck, I needed health insurance. And so I got internships, and sort of prepared myself and pushed my way into working in government. And the day after I graduated from college, I began as special assistant to Lieutenant Governor Kevin Sullivan. And I helped him in various ways. I would travel around the state with him. Sometimes I'd help him on the floor of the Senate, all sorts of different things. And he was very, very kind to me and tolerated. I remember that first we had our Christmas party, and everybody gave gifts, and I gave everybody comic books. I gave them graphic novels that I thought they would like. And he was so sweet about it, like he didn't know what I was doing. And this is back in 2006, 2007, when, like, this was not something most people did. And so that's where I kind of got my start. But I would go to the comic book shop for kind of like a like a just a I guess we call it self-care these days, you know? And so then, I had another couple jobs and eventually ended up working for John Lewis. I started in his office answering his mail. And over the years, I got promoted several times. I became his digital director and policy advisor. I was his campaign press secretary. Then I was his campaign communications director. And I did a lot of these different jobs for him. We became very, very close. He would say I was like a son to him. And um, it was on that first campaign that he was really struggling to tell his story. He'd had these vigorous primary challenges, like he this veneer of unbeatability had disappeared, and it was a really tough time for him personally and emotionally. And so the contributions I could make uh, involved bringing that creativity, those things that I had sort of put by the wayside because I needed a regular paycheck and a professional job. Um, and so I suggested there's another number of things. I got him online. I got him to use social media. That's sort of where Good Trouble really got popularized as a hashtag that I used. But it was in conjunction with this idea to do a comic book. And that all started because we were having these meetings about how we tell a story. And everybody had this same idea, right? They were all like, let's do a documentary. And bless your heart, there have been a lot of John Lewis documentaries. I'm in some of them. Like, I don't need to see the same footage over and over again telling me in 90 minutes about John Lewis's story, because John Lewis's story is far more complicated than you can be told in 90 minutes.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it's actually done a disservice. That's how he got into that predicament, is because they try and tell the 90-minute version, and they end up losing the beauty and the complexity and the sophistication that he brought to his own career. And so I suggested that the congressman should write a comic book. And at first, he later told a reporter, they asked him, they said, what did you think when that young man suggested that you should write a comic book? And he leaned in, he goes, I thought that boy had lost his mind. But that's like a totally fair reaction in 2008 to writing a comic book. And this is like the same. I mean, the Iron Man movie had come out about 60 days before I suggested this, and the more I thought about it, especially the more I learned about the civil rights movement, the more I saw this as a incredible opportunity for him to reintroduce himself to a new generation. And the documentary people around him did not think that. So it ended up sort of being like our little secret. Like, we worked on it and we ended up over the years like building this like private world for ourselves that we kept from everybody else, because they didn't like or understand what we were doing. It sort of was so different from what they thought the world was like, that there was resentment. And the congressman, though, he was so good because he understood the power of listening to young people. Like, remember, I was 24 years old when I suggested this. Right? I was a year older than the congressman was when he spoke at the March on Washington. He understood, right, how important listening to those voices are. And even if that ruffled some feathers, he was going to do it. And so we ended up working for years to put this together. I mean, it took me 2 years just to find a publisher. We didn't have an agent. We didn't have a lawyer. It was just the two of us. And I would write out these proposals, and I would cold call publishers and try and get a meeting. And like, also, John Lewis, they didn't know who he was when I would call them. And I was very fortunate that one of my friends that I graduated from high school with went on to become work at a literary agency. And so he would funnel me the phone numbers and the emails of these editors And then and he'd be like, but you can't say that I sent you, you know. He would kind of coach me on what to say. And finally, after 2 years, and I went to a Comic-Con in New York. It was it was like an independent, like small press comics expo. And I pitched publishers over the table, like, hey man, I have an idea. And finally one said yes. It was small. It had 4 people that worked for them, and that included the warehouse guy. And it went from there. And I think I never really understood how you were supposed to make comics. I just knew how to read comics. But I was also a congressional staffer at that point. You know, I'd spent years being held to the highest standards of research and documentation. And I very much brought that then into the way I wrote comics, because I, at my core, love research. It's fascinating to me to find things and see what someone actually wrote down or said in the moment. And the more I learned about the movement, the more I realized that so much of the contributions of young people had been overlooked. And so we focused a great deal on that. And that's really where it all came from. And then, you know, I think after that point, it's sort of a matter of the historic record now. But, you know, March went on to, you know, spend a couple years on the New York Times bestseller list, hitting #1 several times. And, you know, I won a bunch of Eisners and like the National Book Award and everything else. Um, but for me, I think one of the most special parts about it was that I got to share this world with the congressman, this world of comics that I had loved since I was a kid, and show him the power that it had to bring new ideas into the culture. And in large part, it became responsible for the status that which he reached before the end of his life. You know, now he's mentioned on the same level with Dr. King, but when we started this, he wasn't. And March is taught in all these schools and everything else, although I think there's some people trying to make that not happen anymore. But as a creator, as an independent person, the freedom that then gave me, because after he passed away, everybody, I was really surprised seeing so many people around the congressman seeing his death as an opportunity for them to move up. And to me, it was the loss of a father figure, a great friend, and I just didn't have the emotional capacity to do that the way other people did. And my mother had passed away in 2017. And just after we won the National Book Award, she got to see all of that. Matter of fact, my mother would wear the medal. She asked me if, so I won a bunch of medals. This is a real silly thing, but you know, I have a bunch of medals. And um, my mother asked at one point, she said, can I have one? You have more than one now, son. And I said, of course, Mama. And I gave her my National Book Award medal. And after she passed, you know, I would go back to the home. Mama had started a small farm, and I would try and keep it up. I would try and fix it back up because it had kind of gotten in disrepair when she got sick. And people around town started telling me this story that Mama, in the last 6 months of her life, would wear the medal around town. She would go to the grocery store with this big Flava Flav looking medal on.
That's so awesome, though.
And so you know, after the congressman died, I just decided I had enough. I think we can all agree that our politics are toxic. Um, and I think there is fault on all sides for that. And I did not want to be a part of it. and I felt like I'd paid my dues. I'd spent nearly 20 years working in Congress or in legislatures. I had made my contribution in that way. And for the first time in my life, the creative space was open to me. And in a way that few people ever have it be open to them. Now I come to a publisher or a company with a wild idea, they take it very seriously, you know?
It
Um,
would be stupid not to.
yeah. And so, I've gotten to do Captain America. I put Captain America in the civil rights movement and showed how he would fail. I got to make Damian Wayne, Batman's son, half Turkish, like I am. There was no character for me to look and see myself in when I was a kid. So I just made one and actually was able to prove to DC why this made sense because of the underpinnings of the Al Ghul family and how Denny O'Neil and had created them and everything like that. And I've gotten to, create comics for the New York City Department of Education. I got to co-write a VR project for Time. I got to do all sorts of creative things that I never thought would be open to someone born in my station, right? Like, poor kids don't get those gigs. And yet here I was, and here I remain. And so now I get to work on this. I'm working on a new book. Hopefully I can tell you about it in the new year. It's with a really special woman who's got a tremendous story. And it's also about food because I think there is great questions that we have to ask ourselves about what we've done to the food that we eat and how we eat it and how we grow it and how we treat the animals that sustain us, how we grow these vegetables and these fruits. Um, there's a lot of fundamental questions about life that I think this book will hopefully at least ask and put in front of people and maybe help them rethink the way we do things a little bit. Because I also realized these books have far more power than any elected official.
Mhm.
An elected official can move language around on a page or they can move numbers around, but they cannot influence the way people see the world in nearly as successful a fashion as a powerful book or a powerful story. And that's been my real focus. And in some ways it's been this luxury where I get to um I mean, you see, I get to read all these comics and I get to read books that I want to read and I get to drive my tractor and I get to be as close to free as I've ever felt in my life. And I think when we talk about freedom in America, we don't understand how the financial constraints, the professional constraints exist as limits on our freedom far outside of the laws that we're often arguing over. And I don't know. I hope because people ask me all the time, like, how do I do that? And my answer is you just do it. Like you always have. It's the same thing the congressman would say. Well, how do I get involved? And he would say, you just do it. Because you have to. Like there are moments that come to you where you have a choice of how do you address it, right? What would have happened if I had been a go along, get along Jimmy in 2008 and said, yeah, documentary, that's a good idea. Let's do number 14. That'll fix it. What happens to John Lewis? What happens to all of the people who are influenced by that, right? I don't think 2020 and the uprising would have happened if John Lewis hadn't had his story put out there in that way, if March hadn't become taught in so many schools, because that was the first generation of students who came out of high school knowing far more than the 9 words that the Southern Poverty Law Center identified, right? I mean, the impact of that creativity and of being willing to be, as the congressman would say, maladjusted to the status quo. And there are definitely days where it's hard, where it's very difficult, where you have to be self-motivated, you have to be disciplined, you have to be able to handle the critics, the people who are jealous, the people who don't understand how you did what you did or what it is you're trying to do, who often prescribe their selfish motivations onto you and they don't understand what it is to just want to help. Because I think there's far too many greedy people in this country and in this world. And I think oftentimes the people with the least greed, the people who are the most selfless, are the poorest, are the ones who've suffered, are the ones who understand what it is to pick yourself up and face the system that is totally created to subjugate and to stifle in order to maintain control over them. And I know I wouldn't have been able to do it without my mother, and I know I wouldn't have been able to do it without the congressman creating this space for me to create for him. And I think one of the most important things, if I give any advice to a young person, is to find your mentors. And mentors aren't just people who teach you. Your job, if you are truly forming a mentor-mentee relationship, is to be as helpful to them as they are to you. Right? There's so many people who would come up to John Lewis and say, "Will you be my mentor?" And he would say, "No." You know what I mean? Just no. Like, but the way you knew is someone he was actually mentoring, because now you got a whole generation of people who's like, "Yeah, he was my mentor." And you're like, "Bro, you spent 15 minutes with the man. Like, what are you talking about?" Like, is who are the people who are working with him? Who are the people that went traveling and producing things and being on stage with him? We did hundreds of events together. And people, like, I'll go and I continue to do public speaking. I will speak at colleges and universities and writers' conferences and all these different places. And people, they'll be like, "You're pretty good at this." I'm like, "I better be." John Lewis dragged me around the country for 7 years, making me follow him. You know how hard it is to follow John Lewis on stage in front of 2,000 people? Like, if you suck, they will let you know. Right?
It will stand out.
Right, but that's how he teaches you. He puts you on stage and he says, "All right, good luck." I mean, you have to pay attention, you have to focus, you have to see how he does it. And over time we built this rapport on stage that was fun. I mean, we would make fun of each other and tease each other, and then we would compare notes at the end of the night. He would steal my jokes and use them for himself. Like, one of my jokes was always that, like, if he still had that today, he could sell it for a lot of money on eBay. So then he started using that, and he'd be like, "If I still had that coat today, I could sell it for a lot of money on eBay." And he would do eBay, like eBay. And he would land the joke every time. And so, I don't know, man. Like, now, like, at this part of my life, sometimes you struggle with, okay, well, what's next? And I was talking to somebody yesterday about this, where in some respects you don't choose the projects choose you. Right? And the congressman would say that, I didn't choose the moment chose me. You just have to be willing to step up and participate and do the work and engage and be open to it. This book that I just finished, or that I'm working on now, it actually came about because of someone that in my family, but also somebody that had been friends with my mother as a child. And she didn't have any connection to the people I'm working with. But when she came to my mother's funeral and comforted me, that emotion that she instilled in me in that moment made it so that when I came across this other person, I felt like it was a sign from my mother. The congressman would call it the spirit of history. And you have to be open to that sort of inspiration, right? If I hadn't felt that sense of calling and embraced it when I had the idea for March, and John Lewis thought it was so crazy, and then explained to him why it's not so crazy, and then being doggedly persistent for 2 years to find a publisher, and then 3 more years to write the book or the first book, and then 7 more years of promoting and going on the road. I mean, you really do have to throw yourself into it and be willing to commit. And you have this constant struggle of, is this the right path? And I think when you find something that emotionally resonates with you to work on, like there are some projects I do because they make, 9, 10-year-old me happy, like Batman. Dude, I did Batman. Like, whoa, like I did Captain America. Like I got a few more characters that I want to tick off, and I'm working on it.
That's like my
But
top two also, like Batman and Captain America, especially as a history teacher. That's, you check off those two, you've done a wonder right there.
well, I'm still trying to get in with the X-Men. That's my next
Oh
goal.
yeah, that would be a good one too. That was an early love for me. My interview, I think I've only got like 2 minutes left because I'm using the free version of Zoom. So I'll wrap up a little bit, but thank you for doing this. I have seen firsthand how this affects students. I know firsthand how this affected me when I read it. I knew it. I knew the story. I teach about it, but I didn't know a lot of the story. And getting to see that and read through those books a few times now at this point, it's amazing work. And I know John Lewis was an amazing man, and I have all the respect in the world for him, and all the respect for everything that you've done with this. And I very much look forward to seeing what's in your future and what you do next, because we need more people like you fighting for a change and fighting to make life better for people. And again, I see that every day in the classroom also. And we need more people like that who are just gonna, maybe not even so much worry about changing the whole world, but just change the world around them and make it better for the people around them. And that'll go a long way.
Well, I really appreciate that. And you tell the students when they read that, that actually is me as a character in those books. And it's our story is worth it. Our story has value. Seeing it from our perspective. And if they have time, I'll be at the Clarksville Writers Conference in Clarksville, Tennessee. I believe it's in June.
Okay.
So I'll be speaking out there, and I'm just a hop, skip, and a jump away. I'm just on the other side of the line in North Carolina, and I hope they just keep working and tell their story and understand that um, it's never going to be easy, but the measure of your success is in your persistence.
Well, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me today. I thoroughly enjoyed getting to hear your story, and I appreciate it. I hope you guys have a Merry Christmas and Happy Holidays, and hopefully I'll be able to make it up to Clarksville in June.
Awesome. Well, thank you for teaching and keep it up. All right.
All right, sure will.
Take care.
Thanks, Andrew.